variable, probably the most important innovation in the lives of poor rural people that I know of. And if neither of those had been allowed to happen, if the old Ugandan monopoly, government monopoly over telephones had been kept in place, mobile phones would have been banned and all of those benefits would have been blocked. And finally, it's important to note that large-scale technological change is essential, has been essential to create the surpluses that have made it possible to build and maintain viable social democratic states that provide people with welfare services, better inputs, and give them the time and space for culture and all of the other things that make life civilized for us who are fortunate enough to depend on it. Let me press on. Having said all that, I come back and I look at the other side of the pendulum. We still have to recognize that even those processes that I've described can have disruptive effects that need to be managed and sustained. First of all, and I think if we're going to understand how to do this, we've got to develop a slightly more complex view of scale economies than one often sees. I was looking at Lipsy's book, and he treats scale economies essentially as what I've called here plant-level scale economies. That is to say, the economies of scale that operate with respect to any particular production process, setting up a nuclear plant, producing a motor car, or whatever. Best practice technologies generally involve a minimum level of scale that you have to reach if you are going to be competitive. Those plant-level scale economies are determined by best practice technology. Producers cannot afford not to implement them unless they can perhaps super exploit their labor in order to offset the benefits of high technology. Ugandan cotton farmers, when I was doing research there in the 1960s, were only being paid, I worked out at that time, 3 pence a day because if they were paid anything more than that, they were unable to compete with American cotton producers where 5 workers were being used to look after 1,000-acre cotton farms using high technology. So least cost production does create plant-level scale economies that impose demands on producers driven by market forces. You cannot escape the market and set up a smaller production of motor cars if that's your minimum scale of production. That means, of course, that you can only set up one plant in an area that has a particular kind of margin. It also means, of course, that once that plant reaches its optimum scale of production, diminishing returns will set in. So at that point, if there is increasing demand, there will have to be new plants created, as liberal theory presupposes, and further, free markets will allow these plants to move to wherever costs are lowest. And if we've got full employment in advanced areas, this will move these plants to places where there is less employment, like Ghana when Lewis was working there, and facilitate the emergence of new industrial centers and rapid growth. So plant-level scale economies can have positive effects, but of course there is a downside. First of all, these plants can marginalize less effective local competitors. Introducing this new technology can devalue local skills, cultural organizations and practices, and can threaten the distribution of wealth and power because of course once you introduce this new technology, jobs are lost in some places, people lose their businesses and so on. So they will increase demand because of their greater productivity, as I've already said, as liberals claim, but the assumption that they will increase local demand and replace the jobs that were destroyed locally depends upon some very problematic assumptions. They will only generate additional output locally if the firms that are able to meet that demand are internationally competitive, because if you have open markets, China will supply your local additional demand for doors or shoes or whatever that you might otherwise have had. Or they depend on immobile resources or involve high transport costs. For example, a lot of the growth in Africa depends upon raw materials because, of course, China cannot transfer land from Africa to China, so what they've done instead is to go to Africa, buy up the land, build a road from the land to the port, and export the products from the land back to China. Or where there are scale-reducing technologies, like better seeds, mobile phones, IT facilities, as I've said, or where these countries are able to reduce wages or lengthen the working day. And unless these exacting conditions can be met, what's going to happen when you increase demand, whether by building a new factory in the country, or indeed by borrowing money from the European Central Bank, as the Greeks are trying to do, is that you will simply stimulate imports rather than create development and growth. Devaluation is perhaps the best way of dealing with this problem, but devaluation is not always possible, as, for example, the Greeks are finding out to their cost at the moment. So these processes have very ambiguous results, and we can see that those results are not driven by perverse interventions in market forces, but by market forces themselves. Secondly, it's important to note that scale economies don't only operate at the plant level, but also at the firm level. So if we think about multi-plant firms, i.e. international corporations that have become the dominant form of firm in the modern world, we can see that the reason that multi-plant firms normally outcompete single-plant firms is because they derive privileged access to research, to credit, to marketing facilities, advertising and so on, and indeed to supply chains that give their subsidiaries a competitive edge over single-plant firms. So why is it that the world economy is dominated by huge global corporations and not by individuals that conform to what liberal theory tells us? Well, because of those scale economies that operate at the macro level. Those processes, again, have ambiguous results. On the one hand, the existence of multi-plant firms makes it possible for high-technology plants with privileged access to capital, research, and all of those things to be transferred by firms through direct foreign intervention from developed countries into local development zones. And of course, that's why direct foreign intervention is seen by the liberal community as the primary mechanism for creating equalization and making it possible to get local industrialization. However, we also have to recognize that this process also has very disruptive effects, because what this does is, of course, and has been, to transfer a lot of industry out of developed countries and create significant amounts of unemployment in developed countries. For example, Finland, Nokia has finally closed down its last mobile phone plant in Finland, and I think sent it off to China or somewhere else like that. If these plants, we marginalize weaker local producers, as I've already said, in the centres where they invest. And perhaps most important of all, and what tends to get ignored, is that setting up a new big plant in a local employment, a local high technology zone, also undermines employment in the whole of that periphery and destroys jobs that people don't even know are there. And so, of course, this also has a tendency to create these problems of unemployment and exclusion. Thirdly, and perhaps something that a lot of economists tend not to take up, although not all of them by any means, we have to think about what I call economies of aggregation, spatial economies of aggregation. The competitiveness of firms and plants does not just depend upon their own individual access to technology, but their access to a whole series of outside variables like supply chains through economic concentration of similar firms in the local area, infrastructure services, social and political capital, political order, all of those kinds of things. A high technology firm in a weak area, a high technology firm that tried to set up and produce computers in